Hi everyone, my name is Marine Dunstetter. I'm a front-end engineer at Main Matter. I'm also a French writer and a cat person. It is the 5th time I attend the Ember Fest. Last year I was in Paris, and there's a story I remember about that event. I was having a lunch with my husband when another attendee joined us. He said he was from South Africa, and he was traveling all over Europe. His trip had gone very well so far, but things had suddenly gotten more difficult when he arrived in Paris, the city where people speak French. He looked at us with a big smile and said, "You guys are the first French people I can have a conversation with." And I was so sorry to hear that. The reason I speak decent English today is because I had the chance to work with European teams and practice every day. But only 38% of my fellow citizens speak English, which is an honest European average. Numbers are probably higher for developers, but still it depends what you mean by speaking English, right? Because there's a huge difference between defining a bunch of keywords in a code base and understanding advanced concepts. So imagine you're a young developer in France or Spain. You got your first job in a small company that uses a local language, and you face a problem, and all the documentation you find is in English. The challenge is twofold. You need to understand the tech, which is explained in a language you don't master perfectly. So, depending on where you were born, you won't get as much information from that doc than someone born somewhere else. And you see where I'm going with this. Accessibility is not only about building a good DOM. Accessible also means easy to understand. I want tech to be as accessible as possible. And as a developer who loves writing, I can contribute to that with translation work. Okay, so I want to contribute to that with translation work, and I also think the Ember Guides are a great candidate for that. Look at these sentences. A package manager installs new dependencies from the command line, whether they are used as commands or in the app itself. The dev server is responsible for compiling our app and serving it to the browsers. Or that one about singletons, what the singleton pattern is. It's a bit long to read, but the point is, experienced developers usually know that. But we all need to start somewhere. And what I really love about the Ember Guides is you need almost no prerequisite to read them, because everything is explained or linked with insightful comments. And it's not only about learning Ember, it's about understanding what you're doing to become a better dev. And that's why I started this project, translating the Ember Guides into my native language, French, and I could do this thanks to the time my company gave to me. So first, one important statement. The official Ember Guides don't contain any language switching mechanics. The French website is a different website created out of a fork. And for today, I selected 3 topics to explore how this fork is customized and maintained. Stay up to date with the English version, spell check the markdown files, and handle UI customization. So first topic. We are a small team of translators. Very small. So we don't want to maintain all the history of all the versions of Ember. We want to translate only the latest one. So let's assume it is 5.1 at the moment we create the fork. We start the translation, and while we're working, the docs for 5.2 is out. So how do we handle that? How do we see the difference and adapt our translation? We're going to solve this problem essentially with Git. So if you're not familiar with open source work, you may not know the notion of upstream. So just very quickly, when you work on a Git project, it is connected to a remote origin. This is from where you fetch and push. And when you fork a repository, it shares its history with yours. And what we call upstream is like the equivalent of origin, but for the repository you fork. And Git can help you stay up to date with it. So with that in mind, here is the situation. On upstream master, we have a document which contains, to achieve this, do that. We translate it. Pour faire ceci, faites cela. And then the English version changes to achieve this, now you do this way. Git has a useful command called diff, which allows us to compare two branches, see what lines have been added and removed. But it's going to be super hard to use here. Because of the translation, every single line has changed. And we can't easily see that, for instance, line number 1 didn't change in 5.2. So in the French repository, here is how we solve this. We have a permanent branch called ref upstream, which represents the English version currently under translation, so 5.1, 5.1. And when a new version is out, we check out ref upstream, and we use git diff upstream master to compare English to English, which is way more practical. Now, if you look closely, you can see that now you do this way has been removed and do that has been added. This is because git diff shows how my branch impacts the specified branch. We can see the other way around using the -r option. That's better, but we can do even better. Remember, the French website is an independent website. So we don't really care about the diff in the app files. This is our business now. We care only about the diff in the documentation, which is located in the folder guides release. So we can scope the diff command to that folder using -- the path. And that's our command. So let's, for instance, print it in a file and see what we have in there. You can print the result of a command with the redirecting symbol and a file name. If you use the extension .diff, you can get nice color syntax for your editor. So when we run that, we've got this kind of result. So we have several diff blocks. Each one corresponds to a markdown file, and we have a clear view of what lines have been added and removed. We have two different scenarios here. Scenario 1 is we have translated this file already. So now we can see how to adapt our translation, and the process is really up to us. We could, for instance, open a new GitHub issue, copy the diff in it, and a translator will tackle it later. The second scenario is this file is still in English in our master branch because we haven't worked on it yet. In that case, what we can do is check out master and use the command git apply to automatically apply the changes in our master file. And that's basically it. Once you have managed all the diff blocks, you're officially translating 5.2. And the next step is to update ref upstream to the 5.2 commit of upstream master, and you're ready for the next round. etc., etc. And that's how we stay up to date with the English version, at least the manual process. Now, without transition, let's switch to the next topic. As a writer, I can tell you it's almost impossible to write a text right first time without any typos. And to help you finding your typos, you need a spell checking tool, a tool which can recognize the grammar of your natural language and deduce if the content is correct or not. In the Ember Guides, this is done with unified plugins. Unified is an ecosystem of more than 500 plugins to work with abstract syntax trees. They turn Markdown, HTML, plain text into structured data to perform tasks like listing or spell checking. What it means is, you have a bunch of plugins. Each one corresponds to a specific lint function. You install in your project the plugins you need, and you change them into a config file to create your custom linter process. In the Ember Guide, that config file is remark.rc. Sorry if it's a bit small, but what you can see here is actually two groups of plugins. The first group is remark.lint plugins. Remark.lint check the structure of the markdown itself. It's unrelated to natural language. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We can just reuse that config as is. But the second group of plugins is retext plugins. And these ones check the natural English. So we have more work to do here, because we want to lint a different language. So let's see what we can keep and drop. Retext contractions. This plugin checks that the apostrophes in contractions like hasn't, doesn't, are correctly positioned. It's English stuff. Indefinite article is to check you have no typo between a and an. For instance, do you say a historical event or an historical event? That's English stuff. Syntax URL. It prevents URLs to be interpreted as grammatical values because an URL is not a correct sentence. So we keep this one as is. And now we have the interesting stuff. Retext English passes the English prose into a syntax tree so it can be spell checked. We can't use it, but we need an equivalent for our language. In case of French, that would be retext Latin. Then retext spell is the actual spell check tool. So let's zoom in a bit. It is configured with a main dictionary and a personal dictionary. So what are those things? The main dictionary is essentially two things: an affix document and a list of words. You can see the AF as a format to describe how a word can be transformed. For instance, computer can take a final S if there are several computers. And in the other hand, the list of words is just the list of all the words that exist in your language, and you can model them with the rules in the AF. So both files together give you all the possible vocabulary with all the ways words can be transformed. And aside of that, you can add in your project a personal dictionary, which is an extra list of words. And in there, you can put extra words that are very specific to your context and which don't exist initially in your language. The funny thing is, the affix document doesn't apply to it, but you can't create a second one for it. What you can do instead is to model the words with other words of the main dictionary. Example. We invent the verb to emberize. And in the main dictionary, we have the verb to serialize, which is grammatically closed. So we can use the syntax emberize/serialize to say, these words behave the same way. And so emberized and emberizes exist. Now back to our config. In the French project, we configured retext spell with the package dictionary f4. And in the personal dictionary, we put all the Ember specific terms and all the commonly used English terms like helper or factory that would be very weird to translate. And yeah, so this is our config, and so far, so good. But there are still two things I'm not happy with. The first thing is retext repeated words. Repeated words is a plugin that checks you haven't inadvertently written a word twice. And the funny thing is, in French, we have a few cases where it's actually expected. For instance, in English, we have this pattern with get plus something, like to get up, to get dressed, to get hungry. And in French, when an action applies to yourself, you use a pronoun to designate yourself as a target, like this, me, te, ce, nous, vous, ce. And you can see that at the we and plural you, we have an expected word repetition. And we have very few cases like this in French, but most of the time, repeated words would actually save us from some typos. My second issue is the Ember Guides contains a lot of links to resources and articles that are available only in English. And in my opinion, it wouldn't make sense to translate the title. Like, we can translate the description, what it talks about, but the title is just the actual title. And it wouldn't make sense either to put all the words that compose the title, like web content, accessibility, guidelines, in the personal dictionary, because that's not really what we want, right? What we want is to ignore the whole expression in a given context. So to kill two birds with one stone, what we would like here is a kind of lint ignore instruction that you could put before your Markdown blocks to just disable the linting for specific paragraphs. And lint ignore is actually a thing, but it's a remark thing. So you can use it to ignore lint errors that are emitted by remark plugins. And we want the same thing, but for retext. Unified offered us a pretty handy way to do that. We're going to install remark message control, which is the thing at the top of remark lint, and we're going to configure it with an option object. The name is what we call a marker. It's the keyword that will be recognized by the linter to control some messages. And the source is an array of plugins. And when these plugins emit lint errors, these errors can be controlled with the marker. So with that configuration, we can now use a spell ignore instruction to ignore some Markdown blocks. And that's it. That's how we can lint all our French files. So if you want to achieve something with retext, but there's something you don't understand, I strongly recommend to post your question in the dedicated discussion space. You will get an answer from probably this guy who is very reactive and willing to help. And now it's time for our last topic, handle UI customization. So what do we want to customize exactly? So this is a page, a composition representing a page of the Ember Guides. It would be nice if we could have our own localized logo. And also, we said earlier that we don't want to maintain all the history of all the versions of Ember, so we would need to get rid of the drop-down to navigate to legacy versions. The pencil icon is to encourage readers to contribute and improve the docs. It redirects you to the markdown location of the page and opens it in edit mode. So it's super easy to contribute to the Ember Guides. And it would be awesome to keep that feature, but we need to redirect to our repo instead. The search bar dig into English files. We also have elements on the page with a very specific scaffolding on style. We need to make sure they integrate correctly. And last but not least, the header and footer needs to be entirely different. We don't necessarily want to keep the whole nav bar with all the references to all the English links. It's a community-driven project, so not maintained by Ember organization. We don't have any sponsor, not the same social media, not the same CI tools. So everything needs to be reworked here. Now we listed our needs. So to implement these, we need to understand the architecture behind. What are the Ember Guides exactly? The Ember Guides are an Ember application like any other Ember application, except that if you look into the app folder, you'll notice it's surprisingly empty. This is because another tool is at the core of the system, and this tool is GuideMaker. GuideMaker is a fantastic add-on developed by Chris Manson, who is also an engineer at Main Matter, but a lot of people in this room know him already. And GuideMaker generates a documentation website out of conventions you follow. And GuideMaker is meant to be used with a template add-on which provides the themes and styling to the documentation website. The Ember organization maintains its own template called GuideMaker Ember Template, which provides the themes and styling to the Ember Guides. And this add-on relies on another styling add-on, Ember Style Guide, which provides themes and styling to all official Ember resources. And Ember Style Guide contains a lot of static information, like the link to the sponsors or to the social media, things that we can't really reuse in our community-driven project, so we are a bit concerned by this dependency. To sum it up, for each element we need to customize, if it's provided by GuideMaker directly in green, it will be easy enough to tweak. But if it's provided by the GuideMaker Ember Template, Ember Style Guide package, it will be a bit more tricky. We won't have time to go through all of it, so I'll just show you one example of what GuideMaker can do, and then I'll serve on a plate how we manage the red parts. So let's consider, for instance, the dropdown to navigate to legacy version. It's provided by GuideMaker out of the box. GuideMaker expects you to put your documentation into a guides folder. The release folder contains your current documentation, your latest version. Then you have one folder per legacy version. Then you have versions.yaml, which describes the structure. And out of this, GuideMaker is able to generate the dropdown, and it generates the routing, so each item of the dropdown redirects you to the correct version of the doc. But if you don't need any of this, GuideMaker understands a second structure without version. So what you do is you remove versions.yaml, you remove the legacy folders, and you move the content of release directly at the root of guides. And when you do that, GuideMaker understands it's a one version doc, and it gets rid of the dropdown for you. And that's basically the idea behind the green parts. Now the red parts. So GuideMaker and its template are a pair which generates a website. Websites mean routes, mean route templates, mean route controllers. So when you use this architecture in your application, the components rendered on your pages, they are invoked by route templates which don't necessarily belong to your application, but to the GuideMaker template. And this can make things tricky to customize when the template is not designed for customization. In the case of GuideMaker Ember template, Ember style guide combination, we struggled with a couple of things. So what I decided to do is to create my own GuideMaker template. I created it out of the default one to start with something fresh and minimalist, and which is disconnected completely from Ember style guide statics. And I called it GuideMaker Ember Local Template because it's still for the Ember Guides, but it's translated website oriented. And the idea behind this add-on is it should be flexible enough so all main layout elements that are intended to be completely different from one translated website to another can be easily customized. For instance, we provide a GuideMaker footer component, which is a default footer rendered by the application template. And what you can do in your application is to create a component which is also called GuideMaker footer. And when you do this in Ember, the component defined in your application always prevails over the component defined in the add-on. So even if the application's template is located in the add-on, it will render your custom component. And using this pattern, we can customize all the main elements we want, header, footer, etc. And that's how we manage the red parts. So that was the overview. If you want to help me with this project, please do. I need help. And if you want to achieve something similar, do your own translations for your language, also reach out to me. It would be awesome if we can use the same tools. And before I leave the stage, there are a couple of people I need to thank, especially Chris Manson, who supported me since the very beginning, and I learned a lot from our pair sessions. Great Wizard, my favorite developer in the universe, for the setup of the dictionary. And on the translation side, Agathe Badia, Mr. Chocolatin, and Camille Killerto. And last but not least, thank you everyone for attending this talk, my first talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you a great rest of the day. Merci beaucoup.